Arizona at War, 1940 to 1950. On December 7, 1941, Americans were shocked by the news that the Japanese had invaded Pearl Harbor. The blow was especially difficult for Arizona residents because they quickly learned that their battleship, the USS Arizona, lay at the bottom of the harbor, the worst victim of the torpedo and aerial bombing. A 17-year-old from Prescott, Miss Esther Ross, had christened the battleship in 1915 at the Brooklyn Naval Shipyard using 2 bottles, one containing American champagne and the other containing water filled from the lake created by Roosevelt Dam. Tens of thousands of people were on hand at the shipyard to watch the ceremony as the Navy prepared to launch the largest super dreadnought in the world. Arizona school children had collected nickels and dimes that were used to purchase an elegant silver service for the officers' mess, but most of the funding came from the state's mining companies. The pieces of silver were engraved with scenes from Arizona, including the old log governor's mansion up in Prescott that had been preserved by Charlotte Hall. Also on the engravings were saguaro cactuses, ranches, and scenes from Native American villages. During World War I, the USS Arizona was one of the escort ships that accompanied President Woodrow Wilson when he signed the peace treaty at the end of that war. And then suddenly on December 7th, 1941, the ship was gone. Only 334 of the Arizona's 1,200 crewmen survived the attack. The Silver Tea service was later retrieved by divers, along with the ship's bell and anchor, and all can be viewed at the Arizona Capitol Museum in downtown Phoenix. The wreckage of the USS Arizona remains at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii, and a memorial, which was built in 1961, spans the ship. More than 1 million people visit the memorial each year. In 1977, 80-year-old Esther Moss reprised her original role and christened a 27-foot model of the original ship, which is now on display at the memorial. The names of those killed on the USS Arizona, including several Arizona seamen who were among the first victims of World War II, are engraved on a marble wall. World War II would touch the lives of every citizen and transform the state of Arizona. It would produce many war heroes who would return home to become vital state leaders. The state's mining, agricultural, and ranching industries, so hard hit by the Great Depression, were resurrected as the demand for raw materials like copper, cotton, and beef skyrocketed during the war. The war would also bring many new people to the state to work in war-related industries. In the past, Arizona's forbidding landscape had kept many people away. But those same features now appeal to military commanders who realize the 300-plus days of sunshine, uncluttered skies, and flat desert terrain were perfect for military operations. Arizona's remoteness made it an ideal place to house prisoners of war and Japanese Americans who were believed to be a threat to national security. The unique languages spoken by Arizona's native people, once thought to be so un-American that government officials had tried to eliminate those languages, now became the key to winning the war. The most important change in Arizona resulting from World War II was that people moved. Whether they were stationed on a military base or they were arriving to take a job in the numerous industries that supported the war, people from around the United States were seeing Arizona for the very first time. Even within the state, people were moving to new places. Indians moved off the reservation, and people from small towns moved to the big cities. Arizona would not look the same after World War II. When American tank commanders invaded North Africa in 1942, they discovered that the sand was devastating to tank engines. In response, General Motors who manufactured the tanks for the military, set up a test area on the Gila River Indian Reservation south of Phoenix. There, they were able to develop filters to keep 99.6% of the sand out and get the tanks operational for the Sahara Desert Campaign. Tens of thousands of troops were also trained around Yuma for campaigns in the deserts of Africa. Like World War I, the Second World War spurred demand for copper, cotton, and cattle. But unlike the First World War, when labor strife was the main story, legislation passed by Congress during the Great Depression guaranteed workers the right to join unions and to fair wages. So labor conflict was minimal this time. The copper mines geared up once again, running 7 days a week, but labor shortages were a problem as young men were drafted to fight the war. Once again, workers were recruited from Mexico, and this time even women were asked to work in the mines. Court cases in 1944 finally brought an end to the dual wage system that had paid Mexican-American miners less than whites. But wage differentials for women remained in all fields of employment. Workers were needed in the fields, and many Native Americans, especially the O'odham farmers, left their reservation to help harvest crops. The U.S. government made an arrangement with the Mexican government to import workers in what was called the Bracero program, which brought 300,000 Mexican citizens in to temporarily work on the railroads or in the fields. As the war broke out, the military began to buy up land to build airfields and training bases. Senator Carl Hayden's seniority in the Senate was crucial to Arizona's success in obtaining numerous government contracts. Del Webb, who had benefited from the government spending during the Great Depression to build homes and hospitals, now received huge government contracts to build Air Force bases. In Glendale, Luke Air Force Base, named for World War I flying ace Frank Luke, was built in early 1941 and would eventually enable 13,500 pilots to receive their training during the war. Thunderbird Field at 59th Avenue and Greenway in Phoenix was laid out in the shape of a thunderbird, an Indian god of thunder, when it was built in 1941. By the end of the war, more than 10,000 Chinese, British, and American pilots had trained there. Falcon Field in Mesa, Thunderbird No. 2 in Scottsdale, and Williams Field in Chandler were all built during the war. Tucson's public airport, Davis-Monthan Field, was transformed into a military installation to handle the largest bombers built for the military. The largest basic training installation for pilots in the country was at Marana Air Base. Kingman trained 35,000 men for aerial gunner school, and Douglas was home for bomber pilot training and some of the first helicopter training done by the military. There were many more installations, as you can see from this map. Defense contractors that followed the military bases in Arizona provided new economic opportunities. Companies like Goodyear Aircraft, Air Research, Hughes Aircraft, and Alcoa built plants to construct airplanes and their parts. To keep the defense plants going, women were recruited to work by the government-sponsored campaign called Rosie the Riveter. These women were drawn from the local population, but good-paying jobs also drew men and women from around the country to Arizona. The labor shortage meant that many people of color who were traditionally barred from good-paying jobs were finding employment and better wages in the factories all over the country. However, whites almost always had priority for the highest-paying skilled jobs, and Mexican Americans and African Americans were usually placed in menial jobs, sweeping floors. Conditions improved, but equality was still not in reach. The War Department spent $30 million to build the Navajo Ordnance Depot west of Flagstaff, a major ammunition storage depot for the Pacific Theater of Operations. It was built along the line of the Santa Fe Railroad, and munitions were shipped from Flagstaff across the country. The cool climate made it a very safe place for weapons storage, and the facility helped Flagstaff become a war boom town. Construction of the 30,000-acre village required the work of over 8,000 people, and when it was completed, it employed 2,000 additional workers, including numerous members of the Navajo and Hopi tribes. The Army built hogans at the installation to entice Navajos to come and work, and even provided childcare so that women could work. Today, the depot is called Camp Navajo, and it remains open as a National Guard installation. During the war, for the first time, many Navajo and Hopi left the reservation for work or for military service. Despite their mistreatment by the federal government over the decades prior to World War II, Native Americans signed up to serve as soldiers in record numbers. In 1942, the Selective Service announced that 99% of eligible male Indians had volunteered to register for the military, a significantly higher percentage than the general population. Many of these men were, of course, desperate for work. Unemployment on the reservation was high, and this was a unique opportunity for men to travel off the reservation, earn a steady living, and prove themselves as American citizens. However, there were problems with their enlistments because many of the men did not meet military standards. They had lived on the reservations with inadequate food and housing, so many young men were in very poor health. Also, illiteracy plagued the native peoples. On the Navajo reservation, where illiteracy rates were among the highest in any tribe in the United States, remedial English classes were taught, and many young men were brought up to speed and able to join the military. The vast cultural differences between Native Americans and whites quickly became apparent when men enlisted in the military. For example, Navajos are taught it's rude to look someone directly in the face, and that it was improper to raise your voice to someone. Imagine what boot camp was like for these young men when a drill sergeant was yelling at them to look him in the eyes. Of course, many of these men had had exposure to military training during their years at boarding school, and they were used to long marches and standing on their feet for hours, something they all had to do on the reservation where automobiles were rare and they spent long hours herding sheep. Some of the cultural differences would be crucial to the success of the war. During World War I, the military had experimented with using Native American languages and codes, and now commanders were eager to expand on this experiment. In the run-up to the war, German spies had actually infiltrated many Native American tribes and learned their languages. But the Navajo lived in such a remote location in the Four Corners region, and their Athapascan language was so complex and difficult for any outsider to perfect that military commanders felt that it might be the one language which they could base a secret military code that couldn't be cracked. In May of 1942, 29 Navajo Marines were identified among new recruits and taken to Camp Elliott in San Diego, where they were locked in a room and asked to devise a code. The men were initially startled and quite unprepared. Carl Gorman was one of the men in that room, and he recalled that when he was just a boy and he was sent away to boarding school where the missionaries had beaten him and chained him to a corner of a cold and damp basement for a week when he had refused to speak English. The government that had demanded that these men forget their native language was now asking them to use it to win the war. The Navajo recruits drew upon their knowledge of English learned at boarding school and tried to find terms that were equivalent to words like reconnaissance, sabotage, or bombers, words that did not exist in Navajo. For weeks, they put together the code that was never broken by the enemy. They devised words like Lotso, Navajo for whale, which became the term battleship, and Jaysho, the word for buzzard, that they used for the word bomber. Because the Navajo culture was heavily steeped in oral tradition, The men could memorize the code and translate a message in 20 seconds. A code machine needed 2 minutes to decipher the same message. Eventually, 420 code talkers served in the military, and no one on the outside of a small circle of intelligence officers knew of their work. Most of the men were Navajo, but Hopi, Comanche, Sioux, Chippewas, Seminoles, and Choctaws also sent men as code talkers. Under heavy fire, they transmitted hundreds of flawless messages between commanders, undetected by the Japanese. Military commanders agreed, were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. The men were sworn to secrecy, and even after the war ended, they were not allowed to reveal the work they had done, just in case their services were needed again in a future war. The experiment was just too successful to let anyone know about it. So for many years, Americans did not know the vital role that these Navajo and other Native Americans played during World War II. Finally, in 2000, President Bill Clinton signed a bill granting congressional gold medals to all of the original 29 code talkers and congressional silver medals to all the remaining 400 code talkers who followed them. The Navajo sent altogether 3,600 men into battle. 300, including 7 code talkers, were killed in action. The Navajo Nation built a memorial at Window Rock on the reservation to remember the work of these men. A twin of the sculpture is on Wesley Boland Plaza in front of the State Capitol building in Phoenix. There are numerous other Native Americans from Arizona who distinguish themselves as well. One of them is Ira Hayes from the Odom Reservation, and he was immortalized in a photograph with 3 other men when they raised an American flag tied to a pipe on the summit of Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. The Pulitzer Prize-winning photo on the left is the most reproduced image in history, and the model for the largest bronze statue in the world, shown here at the right, which is at Arlington National Cemetery. Hayes is the Marine on the far left, at the end of the line, and he has been described as a reluctant hero who believed others who fought and died should have been honored instead of him. Ira Hayes had seen heavy combat during the war, and that, along with the tremendous notoriety from his role in the flag raising, took a heavy toll on him. He suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and alcoholism, and never found peace even after he returned to the Gila River Reservation. He died tragically in 1955. His tribe has constructed a memorial to Hayes on the reservation, and he is honored annually on Veterans Day. The Bushmasters, a ragtag group of Phoenix Indian School graduates, Mexican Americans from the barrios of Phoenix and Tucson, and some Anglos, earned a reputation for hand-to-hand combat in the jungles of the South Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur said of them, quote, "No greater fighting combat team has ever deployed for battle," end quote. Carl Gorman, one of the Navajo code talkers, said, "Before the white man came to this country, this whole land was Indian country, and we still think of it as our land, so we fight for it. I was very proud to serve my country. The Marines made a man out of me. They also made a proud Navajo out of me," end quote. As historian Sharon McGee has said, quote, "No other event other than the establishment of the reservation system had altered Indian life as much as had this war. A lot had changed. No longer sheltered, unworldly individuals, most had earned a consistent, decent living for the first time in their lives," end quote. Returning soldiers used the GI Bill to attend college or trade schools and receive training as teachers, engineers, mechanics, and businessmen. They were welcomed as leaders to their communities, often taking seats on the tribal council because they knew how to interact with the white world. Sometimes the returning veterans came into conflict with elders when they demanded education reform, job training, and they wanted to promote tourism on the reservations. but for the most part, they helped their people move forward into the 20th century. The war also had an important effect on African Americans. Fort Huachuca was the only major military installation still in existence in Arizona when World War II broke out. Long home to the Buffalo soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the military tripled Huachuca's facilities to accommodate 30,000 troops at the outbreak of World War II. It became the hub for most Army and Army Air Corps activities in Arizona, supplying materials for installations in Arizona, New Mexico, and much of California as well. It was also home to the largest contingent of African American units during the war. While the Buffalo soldiers were led in earlier days by white officers, 93rd Infantry had almost 300 African American officers. All facilities for enlisted men were segregated, consistent with military policy at the time. A black officers' club was constructed in 1942 and hosted celebrities like Lena Horne and Louis Armstrong. Even black nurses, part of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, or WACs, were brought in to care for black soldiers. African American women who signed up as nurses faced additional barriers. Their numbers were limited by quotas, and they were assigned only to treat black soldiers or prisoners of war. As many as 100 black nurses were stationed at Huachuca at any given time, and many were later sent overseas to places like England, Burma, New Guinea, and Liberia. In 1945, Lincoln Ragsdale, a Tuskegee Airman, became the first African American pilot at Luke Army Airfield, where he was assigned to an experimental integrated gunnery team. He was, even though he was unaware of it at the time, part of President Harry Truman's plan to break the military color barrier. He later recalled, quote, "They wouldn't salute me at Luke," end quote, despite his official status as a lieutenant. Although African American men and women volunteered for the war, and many lost their lives fighting for a free world, they were angry at the discrimination they faced by their own government. After the war, many of these veterans became important leaders in their local communities. Ragsdale himself moved to Phoenix and became a prominent civil rights leader in the 1950s and 1960s. Women broke new ground during the war as well. They had served in the military as volunteers, as nurses, cooks, and laundresses ever since the American Revolution. During World War II, they joined Women's Auxiliary Services, the WACs, WAVES, WASPs, and they performed a variety of support functions: secretarial work, driving carpools, repairing trucks, supply officers, and of course, as nurses. In a two-front war, the military quickly realized that they could free more men up for combat if women provided many of the non-combat services. The WASPs, the Women Air Service Pilots, were formed to allow women to fly planes in all non-combat capacities. They flew in and out of all the airfields in Arizona, ferrying airplanes around the country. Over half of the ferrying of combat aircraft within the United States during the war was carried out by female pilots. Despite all of their contributions, women serving in the military were paid wages lower than men of the same rank, and they did not receive the veteran benefits that men received. 38 WASPs lost their lives during the war, 11 in training, and 27 on active duty, all in accidents. Because they were a military auxiliary, not the regular service, the female pilots who died were sent home at family expense and without traditional military honors. The Army would not even allow the U.S. flag to be draped on WASP coffins. In the 1970s, these women finally gained veteran benefits, and in 2009, they were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Barack Obama for their contributions during World War II. Not only was Arizona a great spot for airfields, but the military saw its potential as a prime location to house prisoners of war because there was so much open land in remote regions. There were 18 POW facilities in the state, housing almost 17,000 prisoners during the war. The two largest camps were at Papago Park in Phoenix, where the Phoenix Zoo is today, and where captured German U-boat officers were detained. And the other big camp was at Florence, where 5,000 Italian soldiers captured in North Africa were held. Prisoners were released to work harvesting crops, cutting timber, or maintaining irrigation canals during the day, but they were quartered in barbed wire fences at night. The prison camps were nothing like the ones we're familiar with from those old movies, prisoner of war camps in Germany. Here, prisoners ate relatively decent food, got to attend movies, and enjoyed relative freedom. However, the greatest escape by Axis prisoners from a U.S. compound during World War II occurred on the night of December 23, 1944, when 25 German POWs fled the Papago Park camp through a 178-foot tunnel that they had dug. The escape was contrived by 3 Coast Artillery officers who believed that they could construct small boats that they had made from canvas and pitch they had collected to repair the roofs of their leaky compound. They planned to use the boats they built to float down the nearby Gila River to the Colorado River, and then they would go out to the Gulf of Mexico and escape back to Germany. What the submarine commanders did not realize was that the rivers of Arizona were not like those of Germany. In the winter, before the spring runoff, the Gila River, of course, which had been dammed for years, had hardly any water in it. One officer explained when he saw the almost dry Gila, "Those stupid Americans, they put blue on the map when there's no water in the river." An intensive manhunt finally rounded up all the escapees in January. Many turned themselves in because it was just so difficult for them to find refuge in the desert of Arizona. After the war, many former prisoners returned to Arizona, most to visit, but a few to live permanently. They had made many friends during their short stay, and despite the circumstances, they had fond memories of their time in Arizona. In contrast, Japanese Americans have unpleasant memories of their time spent in internment camps in Arizona. In the days following Pearl Harbor, Americans were very concerned about the possibility that the Japanese might invade the West Coast. Although the FBI quickly picked up any suspected Japanese agents left in the United States, there were concerns that Japanese Americans living in the United States might be spies or help the enemy. In February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order that mandated that the 120,000 people on the west coast of America of Japanese ancestry, regardless of citizenship, be removed from the west coast and placed in internment camps. The 10 camps were located throughout western interior states, and Arizona was home to 2 of the largest camps. The Rivers War Relocation Camp, or Gila Camp, on the Gila River Indian Reservation near Casa Grande, would house 13,000 evacuees from California. The Colorado River War Relocation Center, better known as Poston, was just outside of Parker on the California border, where 18,000 Japanese Americans from California also lived during the war. When the war broke out, only about 630 Japanese Americans lived in Arizona. Most were born in the United States, and about 80% lived in Maricopa County. The boundaries of the military exclusion zone that determined where Japanese Americans could live cut through central Washington and Oregon, went south along the eastern border of California. Then it cut northern and southern Arizona in half, running through the heart of Phoenix at Grand Avenue, turning east at Van Buren, and then crossed the Salt River at Mill Avenue. Those living on the north side of the line could stay put, but there were severe restrictions on their movements. Those living south of the line were forced to relocate to internment camps. Arizona's legislature had passed a bill in 1913 that discriminated against the Japanese, making it difficult for them to buy farms. And in 1921, the legislature expanded the law to include bans on long-term leases to Japanese farmers. During the 1930s, Massive anti-Japanese rallies were held in the Salt River Valley, and there were bombings and shootings, as well as the destruction of Japanese crops and irrigation systems. But this is nothing compared to World War II, when the government forcibly removed people of Japanese ancestry from their homes with only a suitcase of belongings and their bedding. Life at the internment camps was difficult. They were located in desolate areas, and flimsy barracks did little to protect them from the scorching heat, dust storms, snakes, and other critters that lived in the desert. They were given work to do, farming and mechanical jobs for the men, sewing and cooking for the camp for the women. Armed guards in the watchtowers and fences topped with barbed wire kept people inside. The camp of Poston, which was named for Charles Poston of Tubac, was unique among the 10 internment camps. It was located on the Colorado River Indian Reservation, despite opposition by tribal leaders. They did not wish to inflict the same injustice on the Japanese Americans that had been inflicted on Native Americans when they were relocated to reservations. The Army overruled the tribal council, and the Japanese detainees interned there provided the labor to improve the land to entice Native Americans to move onto what would be an expanded reservation after the war. The Japanese built adobe schools and constructed irrigation canals, and they engaged in experimental farming for arid climates. By January of 1945, when government officials announced that they would be closing the camps, the Japanese Americans were released and returned home, but they found that their property had been confiscated for back taxes, and they had very few places to go. Many families reestablished themselves in central Arizona, buying land in the northern base of South Mountain and becoming some of the most successful farmers in the valley. By the end of World War II, more than 30,000 Arizonans had served in the military, and over 1,600 died for their country. Some received immediate recognition, like Sylvester Herrera, who was born in Mexico and therefore was not even required to volunteer for duty because he was not a U.S. citizen. But he became private in the Army and distinguished himself by saving his outfit from an ambush in Germany, and he single-handedly took 8 prisoners. Even after a landmine blew off the lower parts of his legs, he continued to fight to protect his platoon. He became Arizona's only Congressional Medal of Honor winner awarded during the war. President Truman had a little bit of a problem when he was supposed to give the award to Herrera in 1945 because he had not yet obtained U.S. citizenship. Others, like the African Americans serving in segregated outfits, the women in munitions plants, or the WASPs, or the Navajo code talkers, would not receive the honors due them until years after the conclusion of the war. When they did go home after the war, their experiences they brought with them would change the world forever. As it became obvious that the war was winding down, Arizonans looked ahead to what peacetime would look like. After World War I, veterans had no benefits, and many politicians believe that with all the sacrifices made this time around, that soldiers should be rewarded. In 1944, Arizona Senator Ernest McFarland, working closely with other members of Congress, wrote and ushered through the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, often referred to as the GI Bill. This legislation guaranteed medical benefits and pension plans for servicemen and their families, as well as low-interest loans for education, housing, and business purposes. McFarland sponsored more than 40 additional GI Bills to benefit veterans and worked with Carl Hayden to build the Veterans Hospital in Phoenix. The population of Arizona had grown tremendously during the war, with the influx of servicemen and women, as well as war industry workers. Now, many of those people decided to move to Arizona permanently because of the good weather and job opportunities. Evaporative cooling had been installed in most of the wartime buildings, and central air conditioning was developed after the war, which allowed people to live in the desert year-round. The new manufacturing companies moving to the urban areas boasted central air conditioning in their factories for year-round comfort for their employees. The cities of Phoenix and Tucson experienced the bulk of the growth because that is where the largest defense factories were located. Prior to World War II, Phoenix and Tucson had half of the state's population. By 1950, those two urban areas contained more than 2/3 of the state's population. In Maricopa County, the numbers of people living there from 1930 to 1960 just exploded. Pima County experienced similar growth. 70% of the new manufacturing jobs were in Phoenix, compared to 14% in Tucson. The suburbs prospered as well. There was exponential growth in cities like Tempe, Glendale, Mesa, and Scottsdale. Prior to the war, the state's economy revolved around mining, agriculture, and ranching, and to a lesser degree, tourism. But within two decades of the end of World War II, manufacturing output would swell to $400 million and outpace both farming and tourism. In 1950, there were 17 million manufacturing jobs in the state. By 1960, there were just under 50,000. Jobs in the mines grew at a slower pace, while agricultural employment remained flat. The new jobs were with companies like Motorola, which produced electronic goods and performed research and development for the aerospace industry. Motorola's military electronics division relocated from the Midwest to Phoenix in 1949, and by 1960, the company boasted a semiconductor division, a solid systems division, and 5,000 employees. Companies like General Electric, Sperry Rand, Hughes Aircraft, and Kaiser Aircraft followed. These new employers needed college-educated workers. Roughly one-half of all returning GIs took advantage of their benefits and attended college or trade school, so the state responded by enlarging its educational facilities. Enrollment at Phoenix College went from just 339 students in 1944 to over 1,000 students 2 years later. Emma Lou Philbaum was a student who noticed the changes taking place. She said, if a student got married while in college, she had to get permission from the school president or risk being expelled. Well, all that changed when those veterans came back. It was kind of funny to watch everything being turned topsy-turvy. These men had seen the world and risked their lives. They questioned everything, from rules against marriage and smoking to the high food prices in the cafeteria. Things started changing fast. The University of Arizona experienced a 100% increase in enrollment after the war and applied to the Federal Public Housing Administration to build more housing. Student enrollment exploded on the Arizona State College campus in Tempe, from 553 students in 1946 to over 11,000 students in 1960, and housing was hard to find. Most of the returning veterans were married with young families. On the spot where Grady Gamage Auditorium stands today, a married student community was constructed named Victory Village. Couples lived in trailers and Quonset huts, and the walkways were clogged with baby carriages, bikes, and clotheslines. The new engineering firms in the valley, companies like Motorola or Garrett, worked with college president Grady Gamage to create science programs at Arizona State College to attract engineering students to the valley. These corporations also invested in what would become the ASU Foundation to provide scholarships, research fellowships, funding for the acquisition of more land, and ultimately turn the school into a full-fledged research university. Despite vehement opposition from the University of Arizona, the Board of Regents and the state's voters finally approved the change from a state college to a full-fledged university in 1958, creating Arizona State University. The private sector also faced housing shortages, with so many people moving to Arizona and so many servicemen eligible for home loans. Builders like John F. Long, a veteran of World War II, realized that there was money to be made in the home building industry. Long became a pioneer in the mass production of homes in Phoenix, seeking to build quality homes at a reasonable price and conforming to the GI Bill specifications. The average home sold for around $7,000 in those days. In 1954, he built Arizona's first master planned community on farmland he purchased on the western edge of Phoenix and named it Maryvale for his wife, Mary. The post-war homes were ranch style with a two-car carport. Swimming pools became popular, as did Bermuda grass and lush landscaping. Long didn't just build homes, but included provisions for parks and schools, churches and libraries, creating a whole community and forging the blueprint for future housing developments. In 1987, John F. Long was honored by the Department of Veteran Affairs for the construction of the 12 millionth home purchased by a U.S. veteran. Shopping malls followed. Christown was the first indoor mall in Phoenix, built in 1961. Tucson's first malls were Park Mall, built in 1957, and Alcon Mall, built in 1960. 95% of all transportation was by automobile, as the cities of Phoenix and Tucson ignored suggestions to build mass transit systems. In 1960, Phoenix only had 7 miles of freeway, carrying less than 10% of the city's traffic. Unlike older urban areas, where buildings got taller to accommodate growth, Arizona's cities grew outward. Critics called it sprawl, but supporters deemed it low-density housing that gave people a sense of wide-open spaces that could not be found in Midwestern or Eastern cities. Historian John Finley has said, in Phoenix, as elsewhere in the new urban West, people, quote, dwelled in housing subdivisions, worked in industrial or business parks, shopped at shopping malls and commercial strips, and found entertainment at recreational and cultural centers, end quote. Mexican-American and African-American servicemen found segregation and discrimination when they returned to Arizona. Veteran Ray Flores of Phoenix said, quote, in the U.S. Army, I was regarded as 100% American, but when I came back to Arizona, I was treated as if I was only 15% American. Veterans like Ray Martinez met at the first Hispanic American Legion post in Arizona, the Thunderbird American Legion Post 41, to challenge Tempe Beach public pool ban on Hispanics. The group also challenged in court Phoenix Public Housing Authority's plans for a segregated housing project, and they won. In the mines and the smelters, Mexican-American workers in the past had received a lower wage than whites, but vets returning to the mines in Clifton and Morenci challenged the dual wage in 1946, walking out on strike for over 3 months before winning equal pay and benefits from Phelps Dodge. LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, also arrived in Phoenix in 1941. This national organization was dedicated to eliminating discrimination among the Latin race. Members sought an integrated society, equal rights, but also freedom for all to retain their cultural heritage. But in the growing urban areas, the hiring of Hispanics in defense plants was very limited. Ironically, Hispanics were barred from teaching at white schools and at the all-black Carver High School in Phoenix. It wasn't until 1950 when Carver's principal finally allowed Hispanic teachers in. African Americans also found themselves largely excluded from Arizona's new manufacturing jobs. Lincoln Ragsdale, the Tuskegee Airman who had come to Arizona to serve at Luke Airfield during the war, recalled, quote, Phoenix was unquestionably the Mississippi of the West. People were just as bigoted. They had segregation. They had signs in many places. Mexicans and Negroes not welcome, end quote. In 1947, 300 Anglo and African American businessmen formed the Greater Phoenix Council for Civic Unity, the GPCCU. and they worked together with the Urban League and the NAACP to challenge school segregation. There were many cities in the states where Hispanics were segregated in the early 1950s, including Flagstaff, Ajo, Douglas, Miami, Clifton, Superior, Safford, Duncan, Glendale, and Tolleson. So Manuel Pena and other members of the Hispanic community worked with Lincoln Ragsdale and other African Americans like Hazel Burton Daniels to sue the segregated districts. Maricopa County Superior Court Judge Fred Struckmeyer ruled segregation in elementary schools was unconstitutional, the first such ruling in the United States. The 1953 Phoenix ruling was taken into consideration when the U.S. Supreme Court considered its landmark school desegregation case, Browd versus the Board of Education, in 1954. Housing was also a problem for people of color. The Federal Housing Administration financed the construction of homes in neighborhoods that blatantly discriminated on the basis of race or ethnicity. Even qualified black buyers could not purchase homes in non-black neighborhoods in Phoenix, located mostly north of Washington Street. The Phoenix Yellow Cab Company refused to carry blacks in their taxis, and most restaurants, hotels, and movie theaters denied service or required segregated accommodations. As we shall see in the next lecture, many of these problems would continue to be tackled by people of color in the 1960s. In rural areas and on the reservations, war jobs disappeared just as veterans returned home. Unemployment skyrocketed on the reservations. Navajo per capita annual income fell from $200 during the war to just $80 2 years after it ended. Under the guidance of returning veterans, tribal councils instituted programs that brought clinics, police officers, schools, and tribal courts to the reservations. Financing these operations came from leases of their land to private companies to look for oil, coal, natural gas, uranium, and other precious metals. Congress passed the Navajo Hopi Long Range Rehabilitation Act in 1950 that brought $88 million in federal money for roads, hospitals, irrigation, and other improvements like running water and telephone lines to the reservations. With increased access to health care, incidences of diseases like tuberculosis began to decline. Although more people were going to the hospital, many also continued to seek traditional remedies as well, including consulting with a medicine man. Many historians view the 1950s as the birth of the Navajo Nation. This is when tribal leaders took control of their own destiny and started planning for the future of the Diné. The demographic and socio-economic changes to Arizona following the war were undeniable, and the political changes that have followed largely influenced the state till today. Since Arizona became an American territory, its first white settlers were primarily Mormons from Utah and Southern Democrats. After World War II, the state experienced a huge influx of conservative Midwesterners who enjoyed the warm winters when they were stationed in Arizona. The new residents of Arizona enjoyed the golf courses, palm trees, swimming pools, and resort lifestyle that Arizona had to offer. The newcomers tended to be Republican, and a noticeable shift took place in Arizona politics after the war, from Democrat to Republican. There's an old saying in Arizona that with refrigeration came Republicans. Returning veterans wanted jobs, and they found it difficult to find work because of the relative power of the state's labor unions. Labor unions hired men based on their seniority, and therefore young men fresh out of the military who were new to the state often were not hired. In 1945, many of the newly relocated politically conservative servicemen formed the Veterans Right to Work Committee, and they used the initiative process to create a constitutional amendment to guarantee the right to work in non-union shops. The issue found resonance with the newly arrived servicemen, and the initiative passed. It received widespread support in the urban areas like Phoenix, where a new group of politicians and businessmen were gathering to make changes of their own. The effect of the bill was essentially to eliminate all unions in the industrial sector except in copper mining, and to reduce wages 10 to 25% lower than other manufacturing cities in the United States. Lower wages, in turn, attracted many new employers during the post-war era. Phoenix was plagued with political corruption prior to World War II. Public officials received bribes to overlook the gambling halls, drug dealing, and prostitution. During the war, the Luke Airfield commander declared the city of Phoenix off limits to Army personnel because of the rampant cases of venereal diseases discovered. City officials acted quickly to fix the situation during the war because they didn't want to lose the business of servicemen on leave. And in 1947, business officials met again to overhaul city government. They created the new Charter Government Committee and elected a slate of candidates dedicated to clean, efficient government. The committee's model was the military, and since most members were veterans, they wanted to create a government that was free from the graft and nepotism despised by military contractors. As historian Tom Sheridan has noted, World War II had shown the country just how much it could accomplish when big business and big government joined together and took charge. Phoenix had gotten a taste of that transformation. Now it wanted more. Conservative business leaders would play an increasing role in directing the politics of the state. The members of the Charter Government Committee were a veritable who's who of politicians and businessmen and women, and they would shape the direction of the state for the next few decades. The Charter Government Committee was composed of members of both political parties, but the Republicans benefited the most because they had been in the minority for so long in the state. They were part of a wider national movement in the 1950s called the Young Republicans, who rode into political office during the two terms of popular President Dwight Eisenhower. There were men like Barry Goldwater, Eugene Pulliam, Harry Rosenzweig, and John Rhodes. There were notable female members as well, like community organizer Margaret Hance, attorney Sandra Day O'Connor, activist Margaret Kober, and hotel owner Margaret Adams Rockwell. For the next several decades, these men and women would dominate state politics as mayors and city councilmen, governors, justices, congressmen, and leaders in the Republican Party. Much of the groundwork for reviving the Republican Party was done by Margaret Adams Rockwell, who owned the Adams Hotel in downtown Phoenix. Since 1900, the hotel had been the primary meeting place for the state's important politicians. Margaret Rockwell and her female Republican volunteers canvassed the state, registering new arrivals in the party and driving them to the polls on Election Day. Margaret Kober, who worked to protect Camelback Mountain from development and was a recognized civic leader, was elected to the Phoenix City Council, the first woman to serve in 1949, and she served until 1956. Eugene Pulliam was the owner of a large chain of newspaper publications in the Midwest and in Arizona, and he was dedicated to giving a voice to conservative ideals in his Arizona Republic and Phoenix Gazette newspapers. He believed that the state needed to move away from its frontier heritage and grasp modernity. Reforming government, he said, would keep Phoenix from being a one-horse town. His editorials were powerful weapons for the advancement of the Republican Party in the state. Harry Rosenzweig was a well-known Phoenix jeweler, and he led the charter government movement in the late 1940s. He convinced his lifelong friend Barry Goldwater to join him and Margaret Kober in running for the Phoenix City Council in 1949. He was dedicated to cleaning up politics in the state. All of the charter government candidates won council seats that year and launched a wave of reforms. Rosenzweig would go on to direct the state Republican Party. Barry Goldwater was the son of Baron and Josephine Goldwater and the nephew of Morris Goldwater of Prescott. After Barry's father had died, he was forced to drop out of the University of Arizona and returned to Phoenix and worked in his uncle's stores, starting at the bottom, working his way up. Morris's department stores had grown over the years since he had first started in the territory's early communities like Ehrenberg. In his spare time, Barry learned to fly planes, and during World War II, he joined the Army Reserves and hoped to join the Army Air Corps. Poor eyesight, however, limited his assignments to the ferry service and kept him out of combat, which was a great disappointment to him. After the war, he returned to work in the stores, but like his uncle Morris, quickly became interested in local politics. After his election to the Phoenix City Council, he started to work on a much larger campaign. The Young Republicans drafted radio personality Howard Pyle to run for governor in 1950, and Goldwater served as his campaign manager. Goldwater also recruited John J. Rhodes, a World War II veteran, to run for Congress. Goldwater flew the candidates around the state in his airplane, and Howard Pyle won in an upset victory in 1950. In 1952, Goldwater upset incumbent Senator Ernest McFarland, and John Rhodes beat incumbent John Murdoch to become Arizona's first Republican congressman. Goldwater would serve 30 years in the Senate and run unsuccessfully for president against Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Rhodes would also serve 30 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. Over the next several decades, Republicans from Phoenix began to exert their newfound clout in state politics, but they would not go unchallenged. Democrats from rural areas in the southern part of the state would continue to play significant roles in Arizona's development and would force compromise between the two sides. Two questions for further consideration. In what ways did World War II affect minority populations in Arizona? And how did the war change the economy and the politics of the state?